The first winter Johan Bower spent on the Dakota Prairie felt like stepping into a place determined to break him. The wind didn't whistle, it sliced. The cold didn't settle, it pushed its way indoors. And on a February morning in 1874, he woke to ice forming across his cabin floor, only a few feet from a roaring iron stove. It wasn't just his household, it was everyone. Across the grasslands, newcomers had built their cabins exactly as government pamphlets instructed. Light wooden frames balanced on shallow stone piers, open air beneath the floorboards, and separate root cellars dug far from the house. The idea was simple: keep timber dry, ventilate the underside, and let the stove overpower the draft. Reality was brutal. Wind-driven snow packed under houses until the crawl space became a frozen cave. Floors dropped to temperatures that made bare feet ache. Root cellars froze solid. Families burned through entire stacks of wood, only to wake to frost blooming across the boards under their feet. The Hendricks family, 3 miles north of Johan, followed every rule and still fled back east by spring. Their floor frosted over by December. Their root cellar split their vegetables open. Their youngest boy barely kept his toes. Johan watched quietly and took mental notes. He was 34, raised in a German-Russian village, where deep, stone-lined cellars kept floors warm even in the harshest winters. He had seen indigenous earth lodges built partly below ground hold steady temperatures when surface weather raged. And on his journey west, a simple moment, lowering himself into a neighbor's well, taught him how different the air felt even a few feet underground. The manuals might have made sense in Illinois or Minnesota, but this was Dakota, and the land obeyed its own rules. While his neighbors grumbled at the weather, Johann studied the design. Raised floors were being chilled from below. Crawl spaces became ice traps. Stoves could not keep up with the drafts the manuals insisted were necessary. So he began sketching something different: a cabin tied directly to the stable warmth of the earth, not suspended above the wind. A cellar beneath the living room, instead of far from it. A foundation meant to share heat with the soil, instead of losing heat to the sky. He didn't correct the carpenter who insisted deep digging would rot the floor. He didn't argue with the land agent who swore houses needed to breathe underneath. He didn't bother explaining to neighbors who offered friendly warnings. He just nodded, listened, and prepared. Because the prairie had shown him that a house built the conventional way would freeze no matter how many cords of wood were thrown into its stove. A better way was possible. He could feel it in memories of warm floors back home and in the calm, steady air he'd felt deep in the ground. And when he finally broke ground that spring, the neighbors watching from their wagons had no idea that one man's quiet persistence was about to challenge everything they believed about surviving winter on the open plains. The prairie thaw arrived late in April of 1874, leaving the soil just soft enough to dig and just firm enough to hold its shape. Johann took 4 stakes, a length of string, and a carpenter's square into the open field beside his claim. While other settlers focused on plowing and fencing, he traced the outline of a cabin unlike anything the prairie had seen. A simple rectangle, 16 by 20 feet, and within it, a smaller square, 12 by 12. That square would become the cellar. To most homesteaders, a cellar was a shallow pit meant only for storing vegetables, and nearly always kept at a distance from the main house. But Johann intended something entirely different. His cellar would not be separate. It would be the core of the home itself, a thermal anchor tied to the earth's stable temperatures. He began digging through the black loam with a spade, then struck the heavy Dakota clay that resisted the blade with every hit. By 4 feet down, water seeped along the walls. By 6 feet, he hit dense blue clay that required a pickaxe. Neighbors rode past and shook their heads. "Going too deep," one warned. "You'll rot your floors," said another. "Should have followed the manual," someone muttered. Johann kept working. He remembered the deep stone cellars beneath houses in his German-Russian village, spaces that never froze even in brutal winters. He remembered seeing indigenous earth lodges along the Missouri River, built partly below ground, warm in winter and cool in summer. He remembered lowering himself into a well during a January thaw and feeling the soft warmth 30 feet down. Those memories guided every stroke of his spade. At 10 feet below where the cabin floor would sit, he finally reached the depth he wanted. Down there, the air felt different, steady, calm. The temperature hovered around 50 degrees, untouched by the violence of surface weather. This was the warmth he needed to anchor his home. He widened the excavation to its full 12-foot width and began the stonework. He placed flat stones along the perimeter, forming an 18-inch thick ledge, rising 6 feet from the cellar floor. Instead of supporting the cabin on scattered piers, he created a continuous foundation ring that distributed weight evenly and connected the building directly to the thermal mass of the earth. Between the stones, he packed clay and smaller rocks. Outside the cellar, he dug narrow drainage channels leading toward a natural low point in the land. Nothing about the design was improvised. It was a quiet inheritance from generations who built homes meant to last centuries, not seasons. Above the stone ledge, he set heavy cottonwood joists, thicker than any typical frondar framing. These beams did not hover over open air like everyone else's floors. They rested firmly on stone tied to the ground. By late autumn, the cabin stood finished. When the first true cold snap arrived that December, the air outside dropped to 15 below zero. The neighbors' floors frosted white. Johan's did not. His floors remained surprisingly mild, warmed by the cellar below. He walked barefoot across them at dawn and felt the earth's quiet steadiness rising through the boards. He checked his stored vegetables, unfrozen, dry, perfectly preserved. He checked his woodpile, barely touched. He listened to the wind clawing at the cabin walls and realized he had built something the prairie could not easily defeat. But he also understood something else. A system could work beautifully in theory and in the first season, yet still have weaknesses waiting to reveal themselves. And the prairie had plenty of tests left to give. By the time Johan entered his second winter, the cellar had already proven its worth. The vegetables stayed firm. The floors stayed warmer than any cabin built on piers, and his woodpile shrank at a slower pace than anyone else's. But the cabin was not perfect. Cold currents crept upward through the plank floor, curling around the family's ankles as they sat at the table. The children instinctively lifted their feet onto the chairs. Maria's spinning wheel, set near the outer wall, stayed cold no matter how fiercely the stove glowed. Then came the moisture. The cellar began to sweat on mild days. Condensation formed on the underside of the joists. A musty smell crept into corners. Root vegetables showed the first hints of sprouting. Johan had solved the freezing floors, but he had created a new problem by sealing the cellar too tightly. Moisture had nowhere to go. Airflow had been ignored. The manuals were wrong about many things, but on ventilation, they had stumbled into part of the truth. He began searching for better answers. A Norwegian neighbor told him how his father banked earth against log houses every autumn to shield foundations from the wind. A Lakota carpenter showed him how traditional earth lodges balanced air with two openings, one low, one high, to keep circulation steady without losing heat. An army circular explained how barracks managed airflow using paired vents sized to room volume. Johan combined all of it. First, he dug a trench around the cabin and built a 3-foot-high sod skirt made of prairie blocks laid grass side down. He sloped the exterior with clay to shed rain and lined the base with gravel to drain water away from the walls. Second, he turned his single-layer floor into a double floor. He spread a layer of fine clay and sand over the old planks, thickest near the exterior, where cold pressed hardest, and then laid tight-fitting oak boards over the top. This sealed drafts while preserving slow thermal transfer from the cellar below. Third, he installed a controlled ventilation system, a low intake shaft near the cellar floor and a high exhaust shaft that rose near the stovepipe. Both were fitted with wooden dampers to adjust airflow by season. The results were immediate. No more musty smell, no more condensation, no more uneven temperatures, no more drafts curling across the floor. The cabin became a steady, breathable, warm-bellied structure, closer to an earth lodge than a conventional claim shanty. Neighbors noticed. Some asked questions quietly. Some studied the sod skirt with cautious interest. Some, embarrassed by their earlier doubts, asked how they might try something similar. Johan didn't boast. He simply explained what he'd observed and adjusted. Stories like his remind us that resilience often comes from listening to the land, to old world knowledge, and to traditions older than the printed manuals. If you value these lessons, consider supporting Frontier Tales of America. Together we can keep forgotten wisdom alive. But Johan also sensed something else. The prairie had one more test waiting for him, a test no careful design could avoid, and no manual could ever prepare a family for. The third winter arrived quietly, almost suspiciously gentle. On the morning of January 12th, 1888, the air felt soft. The sky washed in pale grays, and the temperature hovered just below freezing. Children walked to school without scarves. Farmers chopped wood in light coats. Even the livestock moved lazily, unaware of what was about to strike. Johan sensed something wrong long before anyone else did. While hauling water from the well, he noticed a dark smear on the western horizon. It wasn't a cloud, it was a wall. A solid, advancing front stretching across the edge of the sky. By mid-afternoon, the prairie changed in an instant. The temperature plunged 40 degrees in only a few hours. Winds roared across the land, powerful enough to tear breath from the lungs. Snow became a horizontal blur that stung the skin like needles. Visibility dropped to mere feet. Across Dakota Territory, the storm hit like a living force. Teachers tried to lead children home from school, but many were swallowed by the blinding white. Newspapers later called it the Schoolchildren's blizzard, a storm so sudden and so violent that even seasoned settlers were caught off guard. The storm slammed into Johan's cabin with a force that shook the walls. Wind rattled the windows like loose bones. Snow packed itself against the door until it no longer opened. Inside, Maria pulled the children close as the stove roared with heat just to keep pace with the cold pressing at the walls. Meanwhile, conventional cabins across the prairie were failing one by one. At the Peterson place, snow forced itself under the raised floorboards until the entire crawl space became a frozen cavern. Frost climbed the planks from below, even huddled on chairs and trunks. The family shivered through the night, burning wood as fast as they could feed the stove. At the Larson homestead, the firebox glowed orange, while the room remained bitterly cold. A cord of wood vanished in less than a night, and still the temperature hovered barely above freezing. Their root cellar froze, spoiling their winter food supply. Families huddled together, listening to the wind howl, terrified that their homes might lose the fight. Inside Johan's home, the experience was different. He moved between thermometers placed in the cellar, along the floor, and near the stove. The cellar stayed in the high 30s and low 40s. The double floor kept drafts from creeping upward. The sod skirt shielded the foundation from the wind's bite, and the controlled ventilation shafts prevented the air from becoming stale without allowing warmth to escape. The main room held steady in the 40s, even as the storm raged for hour after hour. It wasn't comfortable, but it was safe, something many prairie families could not say that terrible night. For 36 hours, the blizzard assaulted the plains. Snow buried barns and houses. Chimneys collapsed. Some families froze within yards of shelter. Others lost entire cellars of food. But inside Johan's cabin, the earth-coupled design did exactly what he had hoped. It steadied the climate when the sky fell apart. As the storm finally weakened and dawn revealed a silent world of white, Johan sat with his children, wrapped in blankets, and felt a quiet, powerful truth settle into him. His cabin had endured, not because it resisted the prairie, but because it had been built to work with it. And across the frozen township, neighbors began to understand that their trusted building manuals had failed them, while Johan's old-world wisdom had saved his home. When the storm passed, the prairie looked like a frozen ocean. Drifts rose taller than wagons. Fences poked from the snow like broken ribs. Families emerged slowly from their homes, faces worn, and eyes hollow from a night spent fighting the cold. And then they saw Johan's cabin. It stood straight and solid. The sod skirt held firm. Frost did not coat the windows. No frantic fire roared inside. To the neighbors who struggled through catastrophic drafts and bitter floors, it looked unreal. Tom Larson reached the door first, his beard caked in ice. He stepped inside and froze, not from cold, but from disbelief. The interior was calm. The floor was unfrozen. A gentle warmth drifted up from the cellar stairs. "How did you manage this?" he whispered. Johan didn't boast. He simply showed them the sod skirt, the double floor, the stone cellar tied deep into the earth, the paired ventilation shafts that guided air like a quiet engine. Every part of the cabin worked together, a living system woven from European tradition, indigenous knowledge, and careful observation. Word spread fast. By spring, neighbors were digging deeper foundations. Some built their own sod skirts, some retrofitted existing floors, others copied Johan's cellar exactly, determined not to relive the night when their homes nearly failed them. A carpenter from another township rode 6 miles just to examine the system. A widower further west dug a cellar under his existing cabin after losing half his food stores in the blizzard. Older homesteaders who once dismissed Johan's ideas now asked him for guidance. By the next winter, half a dozen new cabins used variations of his method: deep and steady foundations, protected perimeters, and controlled airflow. These homes stayed warmer. They used less fuel. They stored food more reliably. Years later, engineers would name what Johan had done: earth coupling, thermal mass design, ground-tempered housing, principles that modern geothermal systems would one day adopt. But back then, people didn't need technical terms. They simply called it the warmest house on the prairie. Johan never claimed to be an inventor. He believed only that the land itself held the wisdom settlers needed. The Europeans who came before him learned to trust the earth. The indigenous people had known it for generations. He had simply listened. If stories like Johan's remind you how the quiet wisdom of the past can guide us through today's hardest storms, consider joining us here on Winds of Thought. Your support helps keep these lessons alive for future generations. The blizzard eventually faded into memory. Children grew, families rebuilt. But beneath Johan's cabin, the cellar stayed steady, cool in summer, warm in winter, proof that some truths never change. And long after he was gone, people still spoke of the man whose home survived the storm, because he understood the prairie better than the manuals ever had.